Hello everyone. Welcome to this fourth session of What is Consciousness? I'm James B. Barbieri, for those who don't know me, Associate Program Director of the Pari Center, and I'll be your host for today. So any problems, technical or not, feel free to just drop me a message in direct chat in the chat section, and I'll try and help you out. Just before we begin the session, I'll just very briefly go through the rules. I'm sure we all know them, but just a refresher. First of all, during the presentation and for the Q&A, if you can please just mute your microphone unless you're called upon, if you're asking a question. But at the same time, encourage everyone to turn on their cameras as it creates a nice educational environment. During Q&A and discussion, if you want to ask a question, you can use the raise your hand function on Zoom, which can be found in reactions at the bottom of your screen. Otherwise, you can physically raise your hand, and if I see you, I'll call out your name and you can ask your question. Finally, all sessions are recorded for archival purposes and for you all. The recordings should be available within 3 days of the session. So I think for this one, it'll be available on Tuesday. So you should receive a link for that then. Now, just to open this session, let me introduce our speaker for today, Beverly Zabriskie. Beverly is a Jungian analyst based in New York and faculty member of the Jungian Psychoanalytic Association, which she was formerly president of. Beverly has also been the vice president of the Philemon Foundation, which is dedicated to the publishing of Jung's unpublished work. And she was also the former president of the National Association of the Advancement of Psychoanalysis. Today, Beverly will talk about emotion, synchronicity, and surprise, a talk which will run for about an hour for just the first part of the session, and then we'll move on to Q&A. And with that, I'll pass it straight over to you. Welcome, Beverly.
Thank you very much, James and Eleanor. Thank you so much for this invitation. I must admit, when I immediately said yes, I was thinking I would be in Tuscany. Then I remembered this is a Zoom era. And where I am is in the Hudson Valley. It's about 100 miles north of New York City, where my office is, where I have not been able to be since March of a year and a few months ago. So it's been a very strange, as it has been for us all, out of time and space kind of time and experience. But I'm delighted to be here. I was not that familiar with these programs, and so I'm going to apologize ahead of time if part of what I am going to talk about you all already know better than I do. But I need to set it up in terms of a little bit of history to make it clearer what the impact was of the relationship for Jung's depth psychology and some of the sciences. Just as a little bit of background, I came into this world sort of through the back door and side windows. I was originally a journalist, and I worked for 7 years at Time magazine. This was in my 20s. For 5 of those years, I was the theater reporter and went to the theater 150, 175 times a year, which was fantastic for analytic training. Fantastic, because I learned a great deal watching those dramas. I married myself into going to Zurich in the next part of my life, and I was in Zurich at that institute for 4 years, and then came back to the Jung Institute in New York for another 6 years of training. How I got to this particular place is still a mystery to me, and I think it's sort of self-preservation that I don't remember how it happened, which is that for some reason I was asked to write a review of certain articles about Pauli. Charles Card was one of them, and let's see, I'm just trying not to see everyone at this moment. But so I had to read about physics in order to do that. And this was rather daunting because my last experience with science was dissecting the frog my freshman year in college. So I did that. They were published in the Journal of Analytical Psychology. And then the next year, I got an invitation from Princeton Press to write the preface to Atom and Archetype. And that took me 2 years of reading about physics. Now, the odd thing is that my particular areas of concentration and study and teaching have been Egyptian mythology. Egypt was called El Keme, the Black Land, alchemy, and then emotion studies. So that combination came together in this study of synchronicity. My personal influences were von Franz in Zurich, Edward Edinger in New York, and Harold Ottmansbacher, who has become a great friend of our association. And Jung describes how he felt when he heard a physicist describe mathematics, in that he fell 5 feet under the floor. And I think when I listened to Harold Ottmansbacher talk about synchronicity, I fall 10 feet under the floor. But so I hope today I can place what I'm going to say within a realm that's of some interest to you. And I'm going to eventually focus on more of what it's like to experience some synchronicities in an analytic container or an analytic process. In terms of reading, I cannot urge enough that you go back to von Franz's Psyche and Matter, which I think is the most brilliant summary of much of the thought that we discuss, to Susan Gieser's essay and the whole of the Pauli-Jung conjecture, which Ottmansbacher put forth. And as I said, especially the Susan Gieser piece. So I urge you to review those and to have them in your possession. I'm still trying to commit them to mind. So I'm going to be reading this paper. I've written about 17 different papers for this conference, trying to to adjust to what I'm hearing being discussed. And I'm going to start off with a couple of quotes. The garden of forking paths is an incomplete but not false image of the universe, as Tui Pen conceived it. In contrast to Newton and Schopenhauer, your ancestor did not believe in a uniform absolute time. He believed in an infinite series of times, in a growing, dizzying net of divergent, convergent, and parallel times. This network of times, which approached one another, forked, broke off, or were unaware of one another for centuries, embracing all possibilities of time. We do not exist in the majority of these times. In some, you exist and not I. In others, I, not you. In others, both of us. In the present one, in which a favorable fate has granted me, you have arrived at my house. In another, while crossing the garden, you found me dead. In still another, I utter these same words, but I am a mistake, a ghost. And that's from Borges in The Gardens of Forking Paths. And here's my second quotation for the day. There is no question that there is an unseen world. The problem is how far it is from Midtown and how late it is open. And that's Woody Allen. In September 1912, when Jung, the 37-year-old Swiss psychiatrist, presented 9 lectures at Fordham, he spoke from the heart of the matters on his mind and the emerging edge of his thoughts, and the evolution of his theory. At Fordham, in the Bronx of New York City, Jung crossed from one theoretical and emotional field to another, as his path forked from Sigmund Freud's. In presenting and departing from Freudian theory, Jung's lectures, later published as The Theory of Psychoanalysis, were also self-statements of personal, clinical, and theoretical individuation. his unfolding of psychic substance, dynamics, and of paramount importance, the neutral nature of psychic energy as a matter of intensities, rather than various iterations of sexual libido. Jung's reputation had been as a psychiatrist at the Berkowitz Hospital, where research had pinpointed the markers of dementia praecox or schizophrenia under Bloiler. There, he also conducted research on emotionally charged complexes as revealed in the psychogalvanic reactions to the word association experiment, which is still, by the way, a benchmark in psychological testing. His first contact in 1906 with Freud had been sending him the results of the diagnostic association studies as supportive proof of the existence of an unconscious Freud was declaring. The suggested mind-body interaction was a move away from Cartesian dualism toward a monism, a mind-body continuum, promulgated today by neuroscientists such as Rodolfo Linas, philosophers Patricia and Paul Churchland, and the dual aspect monism of scientist Harold Ottensbacher. As trauma specialist Van der Kolk would say today, the body keeps the score, while mind and psyche struggle not to lose the game. For 6 years between 1906 and 1912, Jung and Freud met and corresponded. In 1910, at 35 years old, Jung was at the pinnacle of the psychoanalytic world, appointed the first president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. Nonetheless, before, during, and after, Jung declared himself an heir of William James, who posited the bottom-up primacy of emotion before understanding and the complementarity of the conscious and subconscious. While Freud's more biological approach led to his drives theory, Jung remained at the effect of James's reach toward the body and beyond the ego in varieties of religious experience. Jung's approach to complexes as emotional knots, to memories as emotional imprints, constantly updated with the framing of our current consciousness, to dreams as reflections of unresolved entanglements, and to the transferential field between patient and analyst as a fermenting and distilling retort, all reveal James's influence. And just as an aside, the protocols of Memory Streams Reflections is now being re-edited and prepared for publication. And what it reveals is that there was a much larger chapter on James, which was shortened, and the chapter on Freud was expanded. So it sort of tilted the understanding of the influences on Jung. It will be very interesting to see this when it's published in a couple of years, I believe.
Sorry, Beverly, can I just interrupt for one moment? Sure. There seems to be a buzzing sound that a lot of people are hearing and writing to me about in the chat. I don't know if with a headset it could help, or...
I could switch to my iPad if that's a help.
I don't know. I don't know what, it must be something to do with your microphone. I don't.
Okay, so let me see what I could do here.
Sorry about interrupting you now.
Not at all. Why don't I just switch to my iPad and come back in on that?
Perfect. Wonderful.
All right. It could be also where I am, which is quite a bit in the country, but I'll try to fix this. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. No, thank you.
All right. This will take a few minutes.
Yeah.
I don't hear it, just so you know.
Some people are hearing it, and as I can see in the chat now, people are saying they don't hear it, but I've had a few people writing to me that they can hear it, and I can hear it. I can hear a buzzing. So
yeah, I can actually hear it too.
Yeah, it's so strange.
Again.
No. Hello. So sorry about that. Can everyone hear this now without buzzing?
Perfect.
Yeah, no buzz.
Okay. Let me just plug it in. It's lucky I've been spending a lot of time studying the effects of surprise and the unexpected aspect of synchronicity, but I have to figure out synchronicity in Jungian terms, a synchronous event only becomes a synchronicity when you register it with an emotional imprint, and you can find its significance for you. So for right now, it's just synchronous. I don't know if it's going to turn into a synchronicity for me or not, but in any case, let's see where we were. I was talking about the protocols and James and Freud. When Jung spoke at Fordham, rather than elevating sexual libido, he described a general and neutral psychic energy, a matter of intensities, not qualities, which could be experienced through many instincts, appetites, needs, affects, emotions, and conflicts, formed at a range of different developmental times and from various states of mind. Each express themselves in distinct domains with instinct, affect, emotion, and feeling, exciting actions, attractions, and expressive images. But what had happened between 1910, when Jung was made president of the International, and 1912, that first moved Jung and the mind-body continuum toward a neutral psychic energy, and eventually to the psyche's participation in the larger world. This shift from the only biological toward physics had a profound impact on analytical psychology. Jung is arriving at a new theory of neutral libido, and hence to a symbolic understanding of psychic incest, a wide open receptivity to the illusions of associations, an acknowledgement that many sorts of complexes provide the dramas of dreams, a dynamically prospective view of symptom, dream, and image as arising of an implicitly teleological unconscious, interested in the past only insofar as it can enhance entry into a future. In Bohm's subsequent terms, one might say, as explicating aspects of an implicate order. This interest in neutral energy eventually led to his collaboration with Pauli around a neutral language, which could be applied to either and both mind and matter. And as I said, the Geyser chapter in the Pauli-Jung conjecture is an excellent description of this. So what was the influence? A little history. In Soul Machine, the invention of the modern mind, George Macquarrie traces how Descartes' 1637 meditations were countered by Spinoza's 1667 ethics, with its assertions of both a natural soul and soul in nature, of thought as material, of affects as inadequately known ideas, and passions as dim ideas that require control. The Cartesian thing that thinks, Macquarrie writes, aim to quell and distance emotions lest they confuse or complicate or undo certain rational thought on which identity rested. Descartes opined that if one could think of a self as in I am, what could be held apart from body and a passive mechanical nature? Thus, liberated from the sweat of emotions, the thinker would be linked to divine mind. Descartes, and this I put in because of the conversation yesterday with Roderick. Descartes' near contemporary Spinoza, meanwhile, fostered the notion of parallelism rather than dualism. For him, mind is constituted via its idea of the body, which we notice through its changes, active affects, and confused passions. In his view, achieving balance through an economy of affect would allow freedom from bondage for the mind as a finite part of the whole substance of the universe. For both these theorists, Macquarrie continues, as well as Hobbes, Leibniz, Newton, and Kepler, the mathematics of mind and world would be revealed through mechanistic constructs of formulas and number. This is relevant background in the current discussions of mathematical psychology and computational behavioral theory, as emotions extend into behavioral economics, described by Kahneman in his volume, Thinking Fast and Slow, and as algorithms of emotions are being constructed for artificial intelligence and robotics. So what was going on then, of course, is reaching into the now. Now, in The Origins of Consciousness is the breakdown of the bicameral mind, Julian Jaynes asserts that each modern epoch describes consciousness in the metaphors of contemporary science. In January 2011, before the Fordham lectures, Jung wrote Freud of a dinner he had arranged with Bleuler and another guest. We spent the whole evening talking with a physicist about the electrical theory of light. Jung later explained he had met Albert Einstein when they were both teaching at Zurich's ETH, the Polytechnic, in the very early days, quote, when he was developing his first theory of relativity. His genius as a thinker exerted a lasting influence on my own intellectual work. So when Einstein visited Zurich in 2011, he was a welcome guest. And so Jung's being at the effect of Einstein was really the background of his whole switch of attitude toward what psychic energy was. And I think that has not been sufficiently remarked in terms of the evolution of our theory. In his Fordham discussion of psychic energy, Jung adopts the Einsteinian science of his era, insofar as he understood it at that time, to depict psychological phenomena. Einstein had declared that light was a quantum. Jung asks in his essays and presentations, when one sees that a quantum of energy has disappeared, where has this energy reemerged in the meantime? In the psychological scheme, within an individual psychic energy can transform. That is, energy can emerge from, manifest in, and not only mutate through the Freudian defenses of sublimation, but it can change its channel and vector and take a different form altogether, hence transform into a different manifestation in one's psyche and life, with degrees of intensities, actions, and images in the service of various aspects of body, brain, mind, psyche continuum. With his later notions of synchronicity, Jung placed the psyche in the world in psyche on a mind-matter continuum. Today, this approach is termed by Atmanspacher dual aspect monism. Many years later, Jung offered this radical view of psyche substance. The deeper layers of the psyche lose their individual uniqueness. They retreat farther and farther into darkness. Lower down, that is to say, as they approach the autonomous functional systems, they become increasingly collective until they are universalized and extinguished in the body's materiality, that is, in chemical substances. The body's carbon is simply carbon, hence at bottom, the psyche is simply the world. So you can see how far that vector went. Decades later, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung reviewed this topic. His ongoing formulations of psychic energy remained imbued with his takeaways from contacts with Einstein and from 1930 with quantum physicist Pauli. He wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, in physics too, we speak of energy and its various manifestations, such as electricity, light, heat, etc. Just as it would not occur to the modern physicist to derive all forces from, shall we say, heat alone, so the psychologist should beware of lumping all instincts under the concept of sexuality or any specific category. Now, Jung places this notion along the spectrum toward a unity in a view whereby he is achieving balance through an economy of affect. Oh, no, I'm sorry, that's the wrong page. Here it is. The libido concept concept puts in the place of a divided sexuality, split into many roots, a dynamic unity, lacking which these once significant components remain nothing but potential activities. This conceptual development of the greatest importance, it accomplishes for psychology the same advance that the concept of energy introduced into physics. So what he's trying to say here is, in a way, relevant to the topic of what is consciousness. Because in a sense, he's suggesting here that the unconscious is about potential activities and the ego is about actualizations. That theme will come up later. In Jung's psychological scheme, psychic energy can transform, really change its form, not just be a mutation. That is, energy can emerge from, manifest in, and mutate into different degrees of intensities, actions, and images. With this notion, Jung was on his way. Here, his path really forked. So I'm going to read two quotes from Jung, and I'll tell you later what the citations are. Jung continuously expanded his sense of the matter-mind aspects of psychic energy as, and this is from Memories, Dreams, Reflections, pages 208, 209, a more or less quantitative concept which should not be defined in qualitative terms, to escape from the then prevailing concretism of the libido energy. In other words, I wish no longer to speak of the instincts of hunger, aggression, and sex, but to regard all these phenomena as expressions of psychic energy. This is the inherent informing attitude and the Jungian template of the human psyche, its reality and its potential process. Then in 1932 at Harvard, just as he was describing, just as he had finished the Red Book, Jung again addresses this and also quotes William James. Now, Jung often, at the more and more that he was released from his Freudian tendencies, he went back to his great gratitude to William James. And in one place, he cites this: you will invariably find that you apply the word emotional when it concerns a condition that is characterized by physiological innervations. Therefore, you can measure emotions to a certain extent, not their psychic part, but their physiological part. You know the James Lang theory of affect. I take emotion as affect, as it interferes with you. Emotion is the thing that carries you away. You are thrown out of yourself. You are beside yourself, as if an explosion has moved you out of yourself and put you beside yourself. There is a quite tangible physiological condition which can be observed at the same time. So the differences would be this: feeling has no physical or tangible physiological manifestations, while emotion is characterized by an altered physiological condition. So here we have Jung introducing what became a major spectrum of his thought, which is that one went from instinct to affect, to emotion, to feeling, to image. That's the spectrum that is present in almost any analytic process, in any sort of self-reflection. Now, in Western neuroscience, emotion was long viewed as too tender-minded to be a serious subject for research. Until the mid-1990s, it was deemed an illegitimate and unnecessary topic for a laboratory and for funding. When it was finally embraced as more than the sweat of the body, more references to Jung appeared in neuroscientific texts. A Britannica Encyclopedia entry on emotion reads, From the very beginning of scientific psychology, there were voices that spoke of the significance of emotion in human life. James believed that individuality is founded in feeling, and that only through feeling is it possible directly to perceive how events happen and how work is actually done. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung recognized emotion as the primal force in life. In The Nature of Emotion, Fundamental Questions, a James Averill chapter says in its title what the mainstream now is in the current vector of emotions theory. Averill notes that he titles his essay, "I Feel, Therefore I Am, I Think." So here we begin to see the switch to the notion that it's emotion which creates a kind of fuel that actually leads to a concept, and that is a powerful force even in cognition. So Averill writes, two types of emotion theories can be distinguished, corresponding roughly to the distinction between feelings of and feelings about. The well-known theory of James is a good example of the former. According to James, emotions are basically feelings of bodily changes as they occur. But Jung provides an equally good illustration of the second view. According to Jung, emotional feelings are essentially value judgments, feelings about. From a Jungian standpoint, if I am asked to describe my emotional feelings, I would not describe bodily sensations. Instead, I would indicate how I evaluate the situation. Most contemporary theories of emotion tend to combine feelings of and feelings about. So I'm part of this a school which you're probably quite familiar, neuropsychoanalysis, which was basically founded by Mark Solms. And there it's almost only when there are emotions researchers speaking that they refer to Jung. Another Jamesian notion of several part selves stimulated Jung's perception of complexes, which function as splinter psyches, and of psyche itself as a multiplicity within a unity. Depth psychology delved into the enigmas of these multiple layers of self, especially in its intense identification with emotional states. In his self-examination, which he played through the black books and the red book, Jung encountered his own dread emotions by lending himself to the same multiple voices heard by those Burkholz sleep patients who submitted to his word association. He became his subject, his object, his vessel, and its contents. In his black books, which just were published in this past year in October, and the red book, Jung immersed himself in his own sulfuric affect, his mercurial emotions, and salty exchanges with internal configurations of, to him, very real, while symbolic figures of an emotionally intensified psychic life. As I say, he himself became the vessel, the center and the circumference of a self-experiment in the same underlying dynamics that he had seen in his asylum patients. There he encountered the highly charged and heard the voices of part selves which exist in the archetypal layers of our psyches. Now I'm going to read many quotes that I think are some of the best formulations of archetypal images and archetypes from that book of von Franz's, Psyche and Matter. So I urge you go. I won't give each quote, but I urge you to just review those chapters. So there, von Franz says, and now listen to the valence and the emphasis on feeling and emotion. Archetypes are inborn dispositions of unobservable psychic structures that in recurring typical situations produce similarly structured ideas, thoughts, emotions, and fantasy motifs. Not only elementary ideas, but also elementary feelings, elementary fantasies, visions, only when they are stimulated by some inner or outer states of need, either inner compensations, processes, or outer stimuli, do they at crucial moments produce an archetypal image, fantasy, thought, intuition. Archetypes are the psychic preconditions of our entire human existence, and we can go neither over nor around them. We can, however, develop them further or refine them. They not only inform mankind's religious and mythical conceptions, not only the basic categories of human fantasy, they also underline science in its intellectual premises. For Jung, the basic structures are always there, but within them, every new acts of creation are taking place. Thus, archetypes may most accurately be described, this is all von Franz, as, quote, nodal points of psychic energy, systems of readiness for action, inherited with the brain structure, indeed its psychic aspect. Its images are the dynamic aspects of the images. While archetypes are the final observable entities in the psyche, she says, they are not static structures, but rather systems of psychic energy or a mode of various relationship of energy. This parallels the physicist's search not for the building blocks in matter, but transient configurations of universal energy. That's from her reflections on synchronicity, transient configurations. She continues, like Pauli's statistical laws with primary probabilities, archetypes are also a list of expectation values, primary probability for certain psychological, including mental reactions. She refers to David Bohm's grid. The archetypes can be understood as dynamic, unobservable structures, specimens of the implicate order. If, on the other hand, an archetype manifests as an archetypal dream image, it has unfolded and become more explicated. And in terms of neuroscience, I didn't have a chance to, put the people that I have turned to the most. You get some of that same kind of language. And in fact, he even uses the word archetypal in Jaak Panksepp's presentation of affective neuroscience. And if you like, I can send you some essays written by Panksepp, as well as some of the other people that I referred to, even if not in name here. And this section I call Being in the Soup. This is still from von Franz. Archetypes are contaminated with one another. They are not like separate particles, as electrons were formerly viewed as little particles, but are more like an electron smear, like a blurred cloud. At their edges, they run over into parallel phenomena. Comparing the Jungian groove with the absolute categories of structuralists, she emphasizes we cannot separate the archetypes from each other. The archetypes do not swim around in the collective unconscious like pieces of bread in a soup, but rather they are the whole soup at every point, and therefore appear in specific recipes and mixtures. It is so hard to describe clearly outside of an individual psychological context. And I must say, when it comes to the attempt to write up case studies, that really becomes quite apparent. I had hoped to be able to describe to you some of the dreams that patients who were dying have, but perhaps I can instead send you a paper that I've written about that, because that's the one place where something far more definite emerges, even if in imagistic language. So we are in the soup. In a comment soothing to the practitioner aware of limited ego ability in relation to this, she notes that archetypal dream images still have the cloudy nature of absolute knowledge. And in other words, we cannot really grasp it. It's more than we can assimilate consciously, even by means of elaborate interpretations. And this again is in her Some Reflections on Synchronicity. Nevertheless, as Jung wrote, the intimation of forms hovering in a background, not in itself knowable, gives light the depth and glamour, which it seems to me makes it worth living. She also refers to the physicist David Bohm, who believes that just as Einstein added time and space to produce the much deeper concept of space-time, so Jung proposed completing causality by adding a non-causal look. Certain patterns, Bohm argued, are linked in non-mechanical ways to form a causeless order. Its patterns are meaningful and significant and are echoed in both mind and matter. And this is in his Introduction to Pauli Physics and Psychology and Psychological Perspectives, 1991. I do want to mention that I had the great good fortune to be on the roster of a couple of conferences with David Bohm. And I must say, I was so struck by his warmth and his intellectual generosity. He was one of those people like James Hillman and Sonu Shamdasani, who very willingly was glad to transmit what he understood and what he knew. So when Eleanor invited me to this, I had that lovely, lovely memory of him. I'm not going to go into this next little section, but many of the allusions and analogies and self-descriptions of ourselves in physics terms were first developed in what the Gestalt school calls dual function terms. And so we tend to describe ourselves as hot under the collar, as feeling blue, as somebody's cool. That's all the kind of language that we find in our self-descriptions. Now for Jung, and how are we doing on time here, James?
Yeah, I mean, it's 10 to 6 my time, but take your time.
Okay. For Jung, emotions are not detachable like ideas or thoughts because they're identical with certain physical conditions deeply rooted in the heavy matter of the body. This was when in the Tavistock lectures, which is in the collected works 18, he was speaking at the Tavistock Clinic, and Bion and Samuel Beckett were in the audience. Identical with certain physical conditions deeply rooted in the heavy matter of the body. So you can hear that he's starting to read alchemy. He extends this continuum from ideas and body to psyche and matter and states the continuum from psyche and matter exist in one and the same world, and each partake of the other. In therapeutic interactions, projection creates the third realm of activated field of relational energy. The vibrations and oscillations of physical energy fields registered and shared by the two perceiving bodies in the analytic dyad and the reflecting minds are very noticeable in the intensified analytic transferential field. Contemporary neuroscience confirms this thesis. In The Mind-Brain Reality, Regina Paley writes, while most of psychoanalytic literature has focused on the unconscious symbolic meaning of nonverbal communication, neuroscience emphasizes the unconscious influence that one person's nonverbal communication has on another's biology, emotion, and the verbal conversation. They reveal the nonverbal communication of energy, as is well illustrated by a tangent that regulates minds and bodies between individuals, carrying information about bioemotional states between individuals, just regulating the biological functioning of both people. And that is from Regina Paley, 2000, page 95. Now, I think just to put this a little bit in the perspective of psychological types, this probably means more to someone who, like myself, is basically an extroverted intuitive. I so depend on the kind of grounded emotional biological communications of being in a room with a patient to keep me from going off into some raping intuitive rant. So this issue of working on Zoom or on FaceTime or just the telephone, actually the telephone is easier, has been a tremendous deprivation. And I can't wait to get back into my office. But that's speaking from one typology. So what Paley is really talking about is what Jung called the psychoid domain, all sorts and levels of affect, sensory awareness, association, and reverberation that arise from a mutual field of commingled psychophysical energies. Now, this harks back to the notion of field, because another aspect of what Jung took from the writing of physicists like Maxwell, for instance, is the idea of field. And so the inspiration there is that any kind of deep transference, and it doesn't just have to be between an analyst and patient, in each there's a certain surrender to the field of what exists between self and other. Sometimes these emerge through perceived anomalies or confirmed correspondence between patient and analyst. If the therapeutic space is secure, these may be explored and given internal and relational relevance and meaning. If dismissed, they live in the bogs of our brains, made soggy with murky suspicions that, after all, life is fate determined by magic, then destiny guided by choice and a willingness to engage with an otherness. Now, many analysts have examples from practice of charged and synchronous communications between psyche and body. But until recently, we did not really expose them under the illusion that to contribute to science, we must stress statistical results and quantified research. Our fear of being seen as soft has kept us from full description of our empirical experience. While scientists must submit to matter and measurement, they have not labored under these internal restrictions. That's my fantasy. I'm sure they have their own internal. The neuroscientist Gerald Edelman observes, we cannot construct a phenomenal psychology that can be shared in the same way as physics can be shared. Yet he concludes it's our ability to report and correlate while individually experiencing qualia that opens up the possibility of a scientific investigation of consciousness. And Regina Paley jumps into this and writes, perceptual processing contains both ubiquitous species-wide elements and personal individual elements. Neuroscience offers psychoanalysis the opportunity for a deeper understanding of how our perceptions are shaped by the past, by our emotions, and by influences of which we are unaware. And as someone whose practice includes the Jungian approach to dreams, I would add that we are not just affected by our perceptions, but obviously also from our dreams. And that's where very often the element of surprise comes in, because the way Jung describes synchronicity, he describes it as bringing in an element of surprise. And a synchronous event becomes a synchronicity when the person who has perceived it registers it in their own psyches and finds its significance. And I'm emphasizing significance rather than meaning. And so far as it comes from this emotional valence, with this emotional valence. Now, conversely, the human moments from therapeutic practice give flesh to skeletal scans and statistics. They offer the incarnated context of therapist and patient working not only to recognize the circuits of the brain, but also to impact the embodied wisdom of the mind. From my perspective, the current conversations among all analytic schools with neuroscientists, most especially in emotion research, will be the terrain on which the empirical experience of analysts noting, accepting, and mirroring the emotions of our patients within highly charged analytic process will be creating common ground. In other words, that analysts of all schools are forging different kinds of alliances with the neurosciences as a third ground. In my own practice, I use neuroscience more as an amplification. And when I'm trying to reach something in the person's psyche that they might not ordinarily be thinking about. So I've talked a bit about where Jung's being at the effect of Albert Einstein took him, and about the range into physics and the understanding of imagination, as Rodolfo Linas describes it as the physics of the mind. The physics of the mind, imagination. And what of Albert Einstein? Years after his evening with Jung, Einstein wrote about how imagination and emotion were essential to his theories. He wrote that he did not put into language, and he did not put in any words, whether written or spoken, as they did not play any role in his mechanism of thought. The psychical entities which seem to serve as elements and thoughts are certain signs and more or less clear images which can be voluntarily reproduced and combined. This was him describing to Jacques Hadamard his own process. For Einstein, these were of visual and muscular type. He admitted that the desire to arrive finally at logically connected concepts is the emotional basis of this rather vague play, before there is any connection with logical constructions and words or other kinds of signs which can be communicated to others. So it's desire, it's that which comes out of an emotional connection. I just want to conclude with a couple of quotes from Jung, and this is from Civilization and Transition, Collected Works 10, paragraph 304. The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and secret recesses of the psyche, opening into that cosmic night, which was psyche long before there was any ego consciousness, and which will remain psyche no matter how far our ego consciousness may extend. All consciousness separates, but in dreams, we put on the likeness of that more universal, truer, more eternal man dwelling in the darkness of primordial night. There he is still the whole, W-H-O-L-E, and the whole is in him, indistinguishable from nature and bare of all egohood. Out of these all uniting depths arises the dream, be it ever so childish, grotesque, and immoral. I'm going to end with one of the last sections of Memory Dreams Reflections, which is called Retrospect. And I've extracted certain lines from that, but I urge you to go back and look at the whole. And this is where this move away from a kind of bondage he was experiencing to just one kind of view moved him. The difference between most people and myself is that for me, the dividing walls are transparent. That is my peculiarity. Others find these walls so opaque they see nothing behind them and therefore think nothing is there. To some extent, I perceive the processes going on in the background, and that gives me an inner certainty. And I can draw no conclusion. People who see nothing have no certainties and can draw no conclusions or do not trust them, even if they do. I do not know what started me off perceiving the stream of life. Probably the unconscious itself, or perhaps early dreams. They determined my course from the beginning. Knowledge of processes in the background early shaped my relationship to the world. Basically, that relationship was the same in my childhood as it is to this day. I had to obey an inner law which was imposed on me and left no freedom of choice. Of course, I did not always obey it. How can anyone live without inconsistency? I am satisfied with the course my life has taken. It has been bountiful and has given me a great deal. How could I ever have expected so much? Nothing but unexpected things kept happening to me. Might have been different if I myself had been different, but it was as it had to be. For all came about because I am as I am. I am astonished, disappointed, pleased with myself. I'm distressed, depressed, rapturous. I am all these things at once and cannot add up the sum. I'm incapable of determining ultimate worth or worthlessness. I have no judgment about myself and my life. There is nothing I'm quite sure about. I have no definite convictions and not about anything really. I know only that I was born and exist. Yet in spite of all uncertainties, I feel a solidity underlying all existence and continuity in my mode of being. The more uncertain I have felt about myself, the more there's grown up a feeling of kinship with all things. In fact, it seems to me as if that alienation which so long separated me from the world has become transferred into my own inner world and has revealed to me an unexpected unfamiliarity with myself. Yet there is so much that fills me: plants, animal, clouds, day and night, and the eternal in man. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Beverly. What a great presentation. Thank you for all those references. You've given us plenty to read. But also thank you for your kind words towards my grandfather, David Pete. I'm really glad that you met, and I'm glad that he had that impression on you. I don't know if Shantina, you had something to say about this presentation.
Yes, Beverly, thank you very much. It stimulates lots of thoughts and questions, and so I don't want to slide directly into the question and take the time for other people, but of the various notions you touched upon, the psychoid nature of archetypes, and it's always been for me a question mark. I hope you will say something more about that. And another little remark is like that the quote of Jung talking about the dream as a little door. That's used by Joseph Campbell as a caption for an illustration which is at the beginning of the mythic image, which is Vishnu sleeping and dreaming the world, including
Yes,
all
yeah,
of us.
yeah, yeah.
So I'd love if you could say something more about that also.
Yes, in my shuffling of papers here, you should, there's this alchemical dictum, return to chaos is essential to the work. And there's a great alchemical engraving of the alchemists in this totally chaotic laboratory with everything thrown around. But the idea is you have to go back to a chaos in order to have things come apart and then be put together in a different way. And that's how these papers around me look here. So I don't know if I'll be able to find this exact quote from what he said at Harvard, but Jung talks about how the incarnated aspect is so essential, and that in fact, it's where ethics come from. And that that's where integrity and wholeness and balance get worked through and worked out, is in the incarnated aspect. So in other words, it's sort of what we were talking about yesterday with Roderick, that there's a way in which everything has to come back into experience so that the mind can come up with all sorts of conceits, the body with its perceptions, and only when it comes down into the lived life does it have any true relevance. And so that kind of psychophysicalism, that reflective mind functioning in relationship to embodied experience, is where the whole realm of reflection comes from, so that we have a chance to, in some way, be more than our incarnated experience and yet dependent on it.
I was also touched by this notion that imagination is the physics of the mind.
Yes, now that is from a man, I had I have about 5 different papers here, and one of them was just to go through the current neuroscience. Rodolfo Linas is especially interesting, as well as the last book of Joseph Ledoux, and I'll say a little bit about both of them because they very much impacted me. Rodolfo Linas is a Colombian, and he was a close friend of Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude. And that created a certain way in which he approached the understanding of the brain. But he was a hardcore scientist. And what he did was he examined the inside of individual brain cells and discovered that each cell has its own agenda. So if we think that we are torn apart in conflict between different complexes, imagine if we have to think of ourselves as each brain cell having a different agenda. But then, besides that, he puts that together with Marquez, and he writes about how our basic state is always dreaming. We are always dreaming. But in our waking life, our sense perceptions cut off what's emerging from our unconscious in terms of images. But he also talks, and he's part of this mind-brain continuum with the Churchlands. He also talks about the endogenous images and the idea that we have images within us that are not dependent on sense perception, but as he says, sculpt and fashion. Our waking consciousness sculpts and fashions these internal images. So he comes very, very close to Jung's idea of innate archetypal images. So I urge you to read him. He is just now become professor emeritus he was the head of the neurobiology and neuropsychiatry departments of NYU. And he writes his basic tenets in the mind-brain continuum. but I can send, if people are interested, I can send many of these papers in for people to peruse on their own.
Oh,
But I'm
yes, please, please.
I'm very fond of him. Then
Rodolfo Linas.
Rodolfo Linas. Yeah.
Yes.
The other book that I've been quite impacted by is Joseph Ledoux's last one, which is the 400 billion year old brain. If you want to hear him speak about it, I'm part of something called the Helix Center. I'm the token Jungian at this Helix Center at the New York Psychoanalytic. They snuck me in that way. And we gave a seminar, which is online through the Helix Center. We had actually one on synchronicity with Harold, which I'll go back to. But this one is Joseph Ledoux's last book. And in it, he talks about how we have every layer in our being, starting from the original unicellular element. And he takes us through all the different layers of evolution. And it's very specific kind of knowledge we have in every category of our being. And he emphasizes that evolution in the Darwinian sense does not mean increased superiority, that Christianity got hold of it in the way it was interpreted, so that the closer that we looked like our projected image of God, the more superior we are, as opposed to seeing evolution as diversity, and increasing diversity, which would give dignity and respect to every element and creature in the world. So that idea that we contain everything within us leads to this idea, this Jungian thought of how we interpret dreams. Because if a snake, for instance, comes up in a dream, we now know through the scientists that reptiles were the first creatures on the evolutionary scale to feel emotion. So it would be snake understanding of emotion, for instance. So it has a very beautiful valence of kind of equalizing all the forms of knowledge and all the forms of existence, which I like very, very, very much. So, you know, Jung wrote that unless brain sciences, he said, confirmed his theories, it would not endure. And that it would take a long time before psychoanalysis and the brain sciences came together. But I think it's happening now. I think it's happening now. He also said that in 100 years, he was talking about from his time, we would wonder if we even knew what we meant. And I feel that all the time. I think consciousness really is being aware of our unconscious.
Thank you, Zabriskie.
Okay.
Lovely, lovely.
What a great discussion. Yes, and people in the chat have been asking now for these papers that you're referencing. So
sure, I'm glad to send them in.
Send them to us, and we'll share it with everyone.
Great, sure.
So how are you feeling now? Would you like to have a small break, or do you want to dive in straight into Q&A?
Oh, I thought I was already in the soup.
Oh yeah, let's go deeper. Let's go deeper. Yeah, let's open it up to everyone, all the participants as well. Then to ask a question, use you raise your hand function, or physically raise your hand, or if you're feeling shy, write it in the chat. We already have a hand up. We'll go to Mark. Hey, Mark.
Hi, James. Thank you very much. Thanks for the wonderful talk, Beverly. Very stimulating. I have just three things to say. Two questions. First thing is I'm really very excited by that quote from Rudolfino, I think you said.
Yes.
You know, this conjecture that we're always dreaming, and I really like that. That resonates with me. So maybe you could say a little bit more about that. Or the second thing is this idea that things that are coming up in the analytical room, synchronicities or amazing things that are happening and maybe aren't being reported because you know, science traditionally has to have repeatability. You know, an experiment has to be repeatable to be valid. But you know, we need to bring in these other unique events that can't be repeated. So maybe that's the second point. And the question I have is, you said about the difference between significance and meaning. So I just wanted to ask you that. That's my question, my main question. You said significance has an emotional valence, and it's not just about meaning. Significance and meaning when it comes to synchronicity, if I understood correctly. So if you could comment on those 3 points, particularly the last one.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. I mentioned in the conversation with Roderick yesterday that whole idea that came out of alchemy, of the soul leaving the body, going up and joining with spirit, and then spirit, soul together, our mind, which then comes back into the body as experience. And so there we have the whole idea that it's only in a kind of reflective process that we really understand what we are experiencing. And I want to put that together and stop me if I'm going too far off point with my very, very favorite definition of consciousness, which is Gerald Edelman's consciousness as the remembered present. Because what that implies is that there has been a dismemberment in terms of a fragmentation that has not allowed consciousness, and that there's a kind of remembering as putting the members of our bodies and selves back together. And that it's in that moment where we are both experiencing and remembering what we are experiencing is the vessel from which consciousness comes. So I think that's just a very profound and very beautiful conceptualization of it. So in terms of Linas, he feels that we are constantly in some ordering of all the different elements that we are experiencing in a kind of dreaming process. And that it's when we get the inner and outer together that we then are really present in Edelman's sense. And I think that's very close. I had lots of quotes from Jung that sort of said the same thing. And so your question was specifically about imagination is the physics of the mind.
Well, no, you said there was a difference between significance and meaning.
Right. Okay, yeah. So I just want to take one step back. When Jung was describing his dreams that actually led him to withdraw from the world for a while and do the Red Book, enter the Red Book, he talked about the fact that he thought he was having precognition of what was to come in the World War I. I think today we would say it was more premonition, that he was picking up all kinds of messages, verbal and nonverbal, from those around him in states of anxiety and dread about what was emerging. I saw the same kind of thing before 9/11. I can get to that in a minute if you're interested. But so today we would say that it was much more an emotional experience he was having as a premonition. So again, and this is why I got to the soul spirit idea. One way to translate that in psychological terms is soul is the capacity to grant value to. And so in what I was quoting earlier, feeling is an evaluation appraisal, right? So that in terms of what really impacts us on a feeling emotional spectrum is because it has significance rather than meaning. And then the spirit or intellectual, conceptual, dynamic side of ourselves brings it more into the realm of meaning. You know, but just as in neuroscience, emotions research is changing the idea of what comes first and positing that emotion leads to conceptions, conceptualizations, so too we would have to think about significance coming first. And the impact of the significance is what pushes us to make meaning. We don't find meaning, we make meaning. And then that's the point at which a synchronous event also becomes a synchronicity. Did I get to it?
Thank you so much. Lots
Okay.
to think, lots to ponder. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for that question. The next question will come from Richard. Yeah, you're muted.
Sorry, I wasn't. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Beverly, I'm deeply impressed by the immense fertility of the ideas that you throw up and put together and combine and recombine. What for me, I'm a poet, and I find that immensely imaginative, to use your own words. So thank you very much for that. I've got several thoughts, and I wonder if I could just try to articulate them very briefly and throw them back at you, or pass them rather than throw. It seems to me, I've been thinking about this for quite a long time, actually, and I very much like your notion that the emotional quality is prime, for example, in a synchronistic experience.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I've been thinking about that, I think it's very easy for us just to play with words, and what we need to do is to get through the words. Now, one of the problems about meaning, if you look at it merely linguistically, we can start talking semantically about the meaning of meaning, like Richards, and we can talk about all the stuff that goes into semiology through Ferdinand de Saussure and that kind of thing, and the sign and the signifier. But that doesn't, or dictionary definitions, have meaning. There's a meaning ascribed to words. And translations, in translation, we use the concept of meaning. Ezra Pound called it logopoeia.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't touch synchronicity. And the notion of significance, meaningfulness or significance, I think is really important. My own way of describing this was meaningfulness.
Mm-hmm.
And another way of putting significance would be meaningfulness. So just going on from that, I'm thinking about synchronicity, and I'm thinking about my own experiences, which have been paramount and vital to me in the composition of poetry. And I feel the composition of poetry and synchronicity are very closely linked in my own mind and experience. Accepting that, there's also another quality in synchronistic experience in my own experience. And that is that there's definitely an emotional pull or impetus or power, energy that can actually last for many, many years and constantly be felt to be alive. But somehow paradoxically, there's also an extraordinary stillness, a feeling tone which is not emotional, a kind of stillness that perhaps takes one into a zone that mystics talk about, and that personally I very much follow Taoist thinking, that a Taoist might be aware of as a quality of the nowness of the now that is both fully emotional, but absolutely simultaneously devoid of emotion. I think I'm going to stop there because I've perhaps gone on too long, but I really, and I think I'll leave it. I had another question, but I think that's quite enough. So you, for your thoughts on this, not necessarily theories, you know, other people's theories. I think I'd be more interested in your own human thoughts and feelings about it, rather than, you know, piling on more and more theory.
Right, sure. There are 6 universally recognized on almost every list. Some lists are 8, some lists are 9. Basic survival emotions. One, you might want to jot down for yourself what you might think they are, but what they're thought to be based on facial expressions from every part of the world that can be recognized because they're part of the survival emotions. They're anger, disgust, fear, joy, sorrow, and surprise. See, that's where surprise comes in here. Surprise is a survival emotion. It's not a social emotion. In that moment of stillness, there's a kind of serenity that is carrying the quality of joy. There's a feeling appraisal in there of what you are experiencing. So I don't think there really is a way. We tend to think of emotions as explosive, and that isn't so, you know, and you're probably in a very deep kind of, well, Jung had this spectrum of instinct, affect, emotion, feeling, image, which you probably live in as a poet. And so there must be something that feels as if you're in harmony, which is a deep, quiet experience of joy, that emotion. So I just offer that as a reflection. I had a great deal of poetry in this paper, which I had to take out, but I just, where are you, Richard? Where are you located?
I'm physically in Cambridge, England.
Have you read the Dictionary of Forgotten Words?
No, I haven't.
It's totally charming.
Oh yes, I have actually.
It is totally charming about Oxford. Sorry about that. You know, but a woman who sat under the table as a dictionary, the Oxford Dictionary was being put together, and just picked up the words that they thought weren't worth going into the dictionary, the forgotten words, which I just love. And so I think that that's sort of, in a way, what you're talking about too, as a very personal experience that's yours alone and not somebody else's. I hope that makes some sense.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Richard, for that contribution. We'll take the next question from Gary.
Hi, Beverly. I really appreciated this very much, and especially your reference to Mark Stone's and neuropsychoanalysis, because and Jaak, the late Jaak Pansep.
Yeah, lovely man.
The issue of affectivity being primordial and superseding language, and the fact that our culture does the flip of that, right? I mean, the Cartesian emphasis on thought over experience, on thought over feeling, that brings us to a nominalistic perspective that's fundamentally materialistic is a concern. And I'm wondering to what extent, I mean, and Damasio talks about this too, Antonio Damasio. Right, that affect is the driver. And I think that's, you know, the basis of the synchronistic experience as well, is that, you know, what happens, we respond to meaning. We may not even know why we're responding, right? I mean, because we can't articulate it in language, but we know it at an affective level. And I'm just wondering about that element of tracing affectivity, which I believe is fundamentally related to relation and communication and the transfer of information, as opposed to material, right? That, you know, going, the work of Peirce, for example, who was a huge influence on James, basically is the idea that mind is primordial, you know, consciousness is primordial, matter is derivative. And that there is one law, the law of mind, which is the tendency of the universe to take habits for something that once it happens, its probability of happening again. And, you know, and just to mention that Mark has a new book called The Hidden Spring, I believe, which goes deep into this. I'm just wondering if you know what your thoughts might be about.
I'm wrestling with that right now. I find Mark Solms is one of the great promulgators of neuropsychoanalysis. Is a South African who has flown to New York something like every 6 weeks for years until he decided it was too much. But I'm having a really hard time with his idea of the conscious id. He gave a paper. Well, first of all, I have met him personally at the Rubin Museum where we had the Red Book exhibit. And he said he'd never read Jung and he didn't intend to, he was too old. But then he showed up at Harold Ottmansbacher's Science of Consciousness conference in Interlaken in June 2019, and his whole paper was about emotion. So I thought that was fabulous in terms of process, you know, moving along in one's own process. But I have a really hard time of him trying to squeeze some of the idea of, like, the Jungian idea of the psyche as an effective regulating, calibrating process into the id, and then trying to make that conscious. So Gary, if you've got thoughts that can help me through that, please send them on to me. I'd be grateful.
So I would suggest taking a look at Walker Percy. Okay.
Oh yeah.
You know Walker Percy? Walker Percy was a physician and an author and a semiotician. And basically what he says is that, you know, that there are two types of phenomena. There's the material phenomena, and then there's the relational phenomenon. And the relational phenomenon is the one of, in language, is, you know, of naming, of connecting the name to the thing, which is a relation that we, you know, uniquely as the semiotic animal, as Casserer called us, the animal symbolicum, right? Have that unique capacity of language to make that relational connection between some sounds or some things written on a page and an essence of something, right?
Well, I'm constantly saying that this or that quote is my favorite of Jung's, but one of my favorite of Jung's is language begins when the dance can no longer express the complexity of human emotion. I just love that. Yeah.
Well, language, I view language as a synecdoche for emotion, right? Language is this attempt to capture affective experience, which is horribly insufficient.
I just also
sorry.
I also wanted to introduce a friend of mine who's here today that Richard might enjoy knowing. It's Marie Howe. She's been Poet Laureate of New York State and just is a wonderful poet. And I think she and Richard and all of us who get down into that layer of that stillness where we don't know what's going to arise, but images and sometimes words do arise. That's where we all share a kind of poetic sensibility. Neuroscience has got a horrible description of that. It's called the default network. Isn't that terrible? I mean, that quiet meditative space.
When we're not thinking.
Yeah, right, exactly. Okay.
We're not thinking and we're not ourselves.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
the egoless place too.
yeah,
Even
yeah,
briefly, for a second, for a few
Yeah.
seconds.
yeah, yeah. This is Marie.
Sorry, I'm eating my lunch.
Incarnation.
Yeah.
Hello. Can I just come in on that and refer back to what you were saying earlier, Beverly, which is simply to talk about imagination. Imagination, however we describe it, is something that we've known about ever since the ancient Greeks. Before that, you know, the otherness of the imagination, the otherness within. And I think we've only got to go back to our own in our own English language tradition of romantic poets, beginning with Blake and going on with particularly Wordsworth and Shelley, Coleridge and Shelley, to realize that imagination is absolutely paramount. How it's defined is still open. And
Well, Jung talks about imagination as the germ of possibilities that arise when the mind has hit against the wall.
Wait, we just have to correct, Richard, with all due respect. People way before the Greeks were using their imaginations, and they still are. I mean, there are many, many people living outside of what we think of as Western civilization who were writing poems and making rituals that were deeply meaningful to them. I just had to say it. I know you know, but
of course, going back to absolutely to the Neolithic and probably the Paleolithic.
Yeah, I mean, I love the Romantics as well, but they, you know, they're only one aspect of humankind, and I love Blake.
Of course,
but it's important.
But when we talk about poetry, we depend on recorded poetry, so we can go back to
poetry is recorded. No, I mean, there are Aztec poetry actions, you know, I mean, things were happening, you know. We just have to, I'm just so weary of the white world, Richard, forgive me, but I had to bring it up because we just can't be centralizing that world all the time.
No, I'm not centralizing it. I'm just giving it as an example. And I'm equally tuned in, forgive me, to ancient Chinese, to shamanistic experience and so on.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. So, I have a question, Beverly.
Sure.
The last thing that the quote of Jung that you wrote, you said to us, was he said that he always obeyed an inner law. That was
he said, no, he said there were inner laws, but he didn't always obey them because inconsistency is an aspect of life. Right,
that's of course right. But what I want to know is, according to Jung, what is an inner law? I mean,
I think it's the sense, and I referred to this a little bit yesterday, the sense that there is something that's missing and the mandate to stay in the quest. stay in the search. If we think of ourselves as something like time is out of joint, time is another great favorite theme of mine, but that we're out of joint, we're misaligned, something's missing, and that we keep trying to grow into some larger self. And then he capitalized self as something that had more wholeness in it, which included all those conflicting emotions that he describes in that last quote that I used. He's all those emotions. And of course, that's another great Jungian goal, is the integration and the living in the tension of all our different emotions. Yeah.
So the difference between the small self and the large S self.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like what in AA terms is called the higher power.
Exactly.
Yeah. And of course, he was very much a part of the thinking that went into the 12-step programs. Yeah. Which had to do with that aspect I was describing before, of the idea that emotion or that any psychic component can not only be transmuted, but transformed. So for instance, I have many patients from whom I've learned a great deal who are part of 12-step programs. And first there was that Jung idea that you had to transfer what went into the spirit in the bottle into a spiritual quest.
Yeah.
So you transfer that into, let's say AA, for example. And then also that might be a transmutation in a way, but then when you go through the steps, there's really inner transformation.
Yeah.
So I would align that a bit in that way. I hope that answers.
An embracing of all the dialectical energies.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, Richard, Marie, and Gary. I think the next question will come from Niels.
Yes. I was caught up by the new ways of the science of the mind, and that you pointed out about the neuron as a unit. And if we think we have around 90 billion neurons in our brain, plus trillions of connections and things, then I'm pondering, we don't have the capability to even model this. The depths of these things we haven't got mathematically or computationally. We don't have that. It's something people dream of, that we get to. There's an expression called P equal NP complete. That is missing. If we had that, we could basically model that. I come from a different background, but because of my interest in computation and having done transportation modeling, quite complex networks, and parallelism in this. And it turns out that there is a specific algorithm that relates to the neuron itself as a complete unit, in the sense that it is directed towards a goal of something, and in that it communicates with others. And then, so this algorithm is very simple. It simply, if you give it a goal, then it will find all the connections to that goal. But it is so simple, it relates to the basically to the potentiality of signals to move. And the way the algorithm works is that it works from the goal, from the future to the past in that process. And that it is that process that gives you then, when you move forward in that gives you all the pathways. So I'm beginning to be interested in modeling the mind now. I've given up on transportation. In fact, the transportation world has given up on me. I can't explain it to them, and they don't see any point in it.
So is that anything
that
like
brings us to the split mind idea of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere is like a forward movement without actually recognize anything about causal effects of where to go. The other one is the right hemisphere. That is the goal-centered one, the parallel computation.
Well, what got me into looking into neuroscience was when a dear friend of mine had a stroke.
Yes.
He had a left brain stroke.
Yes.
And when he was working with a speech therapist, he was more than that. It was not to say speech therapists aren't wonderful, but he was, I can't remember what his title was. And he said to my friend, "Are you a Jungian analyst?" He knew he was a psychotherapist.
Yes.
Are you a Jungian analyst? Because your right brain is much more developed than I would imagine someone with your left brain education. He had been at Princeton and Oxford. Would have. And I thought, and I saw how his mind, his brain found other pathways, and that really got me interested. But I have a question for you. Is what you're talking about like scale-free networks?
Sorry?
Is what you're talking about like the scale-free networks, like of airplane transportation?
It can be either. It can be very accurate distances of time and space, basically. But it can also be much more flexible in terms of that it's just the connectivity that counts.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, I don't know if you can tell more about this person who were playing with these ideas about the neuron as a unit.
Yes, that's Rodolfo.
I would like some. Yes.
He wrote a book called The I of the Vortex. You can take a look at that.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Niels, for your question. Just seeing if there are any hands up, like physical hands up. Can't really see any at the moment, but I could see that the chat was incredibly rich throughout your talk. So many very interesting comments. So I don't know if anyone wants to sort of repeat or talk about what happened in the chat with Beverly.
I just want to mention in terms of response to the last speaker, sorry for a moment, that Jung's definition of psyche is as a process. It's a process. It never ends. That's why at the very end of his life, this man who focused on self-knowledge says an unfamiliarity with myself. I think that's just beautiful. And he's got other places where he talks about the work that one has to do after death. I mean, it never ends. It's process. His other definition, another definition is the psyche is a multiplicity within a unity. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to put that in terms of the last question.
Can I just respond to that? Excuse me.
Yeah, I just like to hear what the moderator wanted to ask. Sorry.
No, we'll just go to Chantal first, and then we'll come back to you, Richard, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. I missed, by the way, the second of the basic emotions you mentioned. First one is anger. The second one is
disgust.
Disgust. Okay.
These are the survival emotions, not the social emotions.
All right. And I'm very interested to hear your reflections about surprise.
Well, it suggests
and the connection with synchronicity.
It suggests an openness, and you know, every synchronicity, even if we know what synchronicity, or every potential synchronicity, even if we know what it is, there's always surprise. and we registered as surprise. And that's the force that gives us the impetus to try to make it significant and meaningful.
Mm.
So, and the same with dreams. If I have an analytic session, and Jung talks about that any analytic session that goes very deeply hits some archetypal layer and something that we would never have known because we don't have access to absolute knowledge emerges. Dreams come up with conceptualizations and understanding I would never reach. And so then both the patient and I are sitting there with a kind of surprise. And unless there are narcissistic defenses that are not open to any form of adjustment or correction or expansion, that want to stay exactly where they are, then that opens whole new realms to explore. So that's where surprise is considered a survival emotion.
Right.
And I mean, I have as I mentioned, I'm very interested in time. And one of my little fantasies or conceits is that because we have such an active world when we go to sleep, if we pay attention to it and we have our living chronological world, that we have a sense of much longer lives because we're sort of doubling up on the experience and the information. And as we know, the brain functions when it's taking in new information, it slows down the sense of time. So we have the sense of a longer life too.
Right.
That's David Eagleman, by the way. He's another neuroscientist who works a lot on time, David Eagleman.
And it seems like the dream itself has an element of surprise in it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Beverly.
Thank you, Shantina. If you can be, if you can be brief. Sorry, Richard, just because
Yes,
I can hear
sure.
people who haven't spoken yet.
Well, I just wanted to say, Beverly, how much I enjoy and like everything that you're saying about psyche as process. And it seems to me that that links very much in with the way that Roderick was delivering his talk yesterday, and as energetic. And it strikes me that the sort of mechanistic view of consciousness looks at consciousness in terms of states, but we all know that consciousness is incredibly varied. Mm-hmm. However we describe it, it spans, let's say, everything from deep meditation to just looking around, to reading a book, to, you know, being aware of a ball being thrown at you. It has millions of different expressions and forms, all of which are constantly fluctuating into one another.
I would very much agree with Bernardo Kastrup, is that how you pronounce his name? With what he presented on the first day. I think he was the first day, was he? Yes, yeah. I would very much agree with his views. I don't know exactly what got built up in terms of affect there at the end. I'm not sure about that, but that whole idea that we don't see reality. We see what our psyches are wanting to see. And that, like with art, John Berger talks about how we don't see what the artist is painting. We see what the artist is seeing, not what the artist is the object that the artist is painting. And that notion that we are always looking at things from a certain perspective. And in that sense, it's got all that probability possibility that the quantum physicists talk about in terms of measurement.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Beverly, we only have 5 minutes left, but there are 2 people with their hands up. Are you happy to answer them both?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, great. So we'll take the next one from Joy then.
Oh, hi everyone. Hi, Beverly. This has been really interesting. I just feel like a impulse to just be kind of wild and not serious. and I'm really enjoying what is being discussed. And now I forgot what my question was. I had a really good question. I guess that's it.
That's the example of emotional arousal, Joy.
We'll move on. But if you come back with your question, Joy, please put your hand back up, and we'll come back to you if you can remember your question.
And let me just say what I mean by that when there's a great deal of emotional arousal, the corpus callosum shuts down and we can't link to our left brains.
So the signal gets
so that, for instance, in an analytic process, it's only when the analyst repeats what the person has just said that the left brain is beginning to pick it up. And then there's and of course, I'm talking about these in really kind of basic fundamental terms, that connections start being made between emotion and conception and logic. Yeah. Rational logic, so-called.
Yes. So I have this little teeny tiny left brain.
Okay.
All right. Well, we'll move on to Gurucharan. I think that's how you pronounce it. Sorry if I mispronounced it there.
Perfect. You get 3 points. Excellent.
Oh, great.
I was quite thrilled and inspired by your comments, Beverly. I guess we did probably cross paths in Interlaken. I guess my question for you would be, in my own exploration of synchronicity and all of this, I'm always fascinated. I chew on the question of uniqueness, which I know, Franz, and you certainly have written a lot about. But it also intersects with the idea of time, which you're also very interested in. So one of the approaches that I've done, you've probably seen this book. This one is by Yakir and others on the two-time theory relative to quantum.
How nice, yeah.
Yeah, I know, and it leads to very interesting questions. So, for example, even in the wave function idea, Schrodinger, and so on, the brain is not reproducible. And so it can't be part of an ensemble or an ensemble, if you like it that way. So there's certain ways in which we have to ask, what's the redefinition on an analytic, a metric level? What is a new definition of complexity that addresses the irreducibility of wholes? And how do wholes on wholes interact? And what would that actually come out like? I don't know, there's a lot more to say, but basically I like your hit on a uniqueness, not as a difference, right? And not as just an anomaly, but as you're saying, the soup of archetypes and the unit of self. How does that, which is all part in one together? Well, personally, it's how would one and myself experience wholeness in its operation? And been a therapist many years, physicist, all that stuff. So I leave it to you, but that's what I was thinking about as you stimulated my own feelings.
Yes, right. Thank you. I had a whole section on different kinds of time, and I don't know how it matches the two-time theory or if it does at all. But I talked about Kairos time versus Chronos time. And Kairos time is being a series of occasions of filled moments. And I think that it's the pleroma idea, that there are filled moments, and that we have our emotional brain is living life on that spectrum. And then the part of us that has to show up at a Zoom conference at 2:00 is functioning in that chronological, quantitative, not qualitative time. So those are how I understand more different psychological times. In any analytic process, and this is what's fascinating to me, it's that if you think about Jung's psychological types and our different ideas of complexes, like the mother complex, the father complex, we are very different ages according to which archetypal field and which complex is activated. So somebody could be much more resolved about the relationship to the father imago than the mother imago. So in one minute, I'd be maybe talking to a 24-year-old, and another minute, I may be talking to a 3-year-old. So I always ask, how old do you feel right now? So that we don't develop in a harmonious equality, so to speak, of time. So that's one way I think about it. But again, the primary one is emotional and Kairos time as a series of occasions. And I think both Pete and Bohm referred to that very much. They understood those distinctions and presented them beautifully.
Thank you very much for your answer. I'm 25 and 75 in a place of stillness woven together by who knows what.
Right. I want to mention that several years ago, we put together at the Helix Center 2 panels on synchronicity. And Harold Ottmansbacher was one of the presenters. Joe Cambray was another. I was Farsad Mahutian, who writes about laboratory experiments where he brings teams of observers in to observe the scientists who are observing the experiments with another. And a dear friend of mine, and how that changes the experiments if the experimenters are being observed. And a dear friend of mine, Edgar Choueiri, who is a plasma propulsion physicist at Princeton, and of course is in the tradition of, David Bohm's work on plasma. So you might, if you're interested in that, it's gotten more hits than any other program we've ever had. Take a look at the Helix Center and put in past roundtables synchronicity, and they'll come up. And Edgar was the devil's advocate who kept pressing everybody around magical thinking, which of course Jung was trying to get away from magical thinking with his theory of synchronicity.
Thank you, Gertrude, for your question. We've gone a little bit over now, so I guess we should start closing the session.
I just want to mention that Laura London, who is the founder and promulgator of the Jung, Speaking of Jung series, is here today. And she just sent a message that she has many of the links to the talks that I'm referring to on the Speaking of Jung website. So Laura London of Speaking of Jung. So she's got all those already, many of them up there.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, if she wants to share it on our Sutra or forum, or she wants to send them straight to us and we can share them, that'd be great. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you.
Well, Beverly, do you have any closing words as to conclude this session?
I'm glad it's over. I have really written about 10 different papers here.